December 11, 1936, a date that sent shockwaves through the British Empire. King Edward VIII, ruler of one of the most powerful nations in history, does the unthinkable. I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love. With these words, he walks away from the throne. But why? Why would a king, born into unimaginable wealth, privilege, and power, throw it all away? The answer? Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American woman who captivated Edward so completely that he was willing to risk it all. But their story isn't just one of passion. It's a tale of scandal, betrayal, and a choice that altered the course of history forever. King Edward VIII wasn't like other royals. While his father, King George V, was a strict, duty-bound ruler, Edward was a charismatic playboy who hated royal protocol. He partied with the rich and famous, enjoyed extravagant vacations, and had a string of affairs, including relationships with married women. He was never the kind of prince who followed the rules. Then, in 1931, he attended a party where he met Wallis Simpson, a bold, outspoken American woman unlike any aristocratic lady he had ever encountered. Wallis had already been married twice, and at the time, she was still with her second husband. But that didn't matter to Edward. He became obsessed with her. By 1934, their affair was the worst-kept secret in Britain. Despite Wallis's past, despite the fact that she wasn't royal, Edward refused to let her go. The British establishment was horrified. A future king with an American divorcee? This was scandalous, unthinkable even. Then, in January 1936, King George died, and just like that, Edward became King Edward VIII. And now, there was a major problem. The King of England wasn't just a political figure. He was the head of the Church of England, a church that strictly opposed divorce. For Edward to marry Wallis, a woman who had 2 living ex-husbands, he would need the British government, the church, and the public to accept her as queen. That was never going to happen. The British press hid the scandal from the public at first, but foreign newspapers published every detail. British officials panicked. The Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, and top members of Parliament demanded that Edward end things with Wallis immediately. Edward refused. In fact, he made his intentions clear. He was going to marry Wallis, whether they liked it or not. This sparked the biggest constitutional crisis in British history. The government issued a final ultimatum. If he wanted to stay king, he had to leave Wallis. If he wanted to marry Wallis, he had to abdicate the throne. Edward made his choice. On December 10, 1936, King Edward VIII signed the abdication papers. The next day, in a historic radio broadcast, he told the nation, "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love." With those words, he walked away from the throne. The entire country was in shock. A British king had never in history willingly given up the crown. And for what? Some saw it as a tragic love story, a king sacrificing everything for the woman he loved. Others saw it as selfish betrayal, a weak man abandoning his country in a time of uncertainty. Edward's younger brother, Albert, reluctantly took the throne as King George VI. He was never supposed to be king, and the sudden change terrified the royal family. But he stepped up, leading Britain through World War II and becoming one of the most respected monarchs in history. And his daughter, she would later become Queen Elizabeth II, the longest reigning British monarch. If Edward had never abdicated, Queen Elizabeth II would have never ruled. His decision changed the future of the monarchy forever. Edward and Wallis married in 1937, but their love story was far from a fairy tale. 1. The royal family never forgave them. 2. They were banned from Britain. 3. Wallis was never given the title Her Royal Highness. Edward, now just the Duke of Windsor, spent the rest of his life in exile, moving between France and the United States. They lived in luxury, attending high society events, but they were outcasts, forever cut off from the royal world Edward had given up. Wallis herself admitted later that she never wanted him to abdicate. She only wanted to be his mistress, not his wife. But by the time he gave it all up, it was too late to turn back. Edward spent the rest of his life trying to justify his decision, writing memoirs and giving interviews. But many historians believe he regretted giving up the throne. When he died in 1972, his body was finally allowed to return to England. Wallis was buried beside him years later, but even in death, she remained a controversial figure. So, what do you think? Was Edward VIII a hopeless romantic who chose love over power, or was he a selfish ruler who abandoned his people for his own desires? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. This has been Execution Detective, uncovering the shocking truths of history. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon for more unbelievable stories.